Hello, everybody. It's Connor with the International Bipolar Foundation. It's wonderful to see you all again. Today's webinar, The Metabolic Therapies of Mental Health, features Hannah Ward. She is the Communications and Advocacy Manager at Metabolic Mind. She writes and advocates for increased awareness of the emerging field of metabolic psychiatry. In July 2021, she implemented the ketogenic diet or therapy and ultimately put her bipolar 1 disorder into complete remission. She now devotes her career to disseminating the science of metabolic therapies. After she finishes this presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so please type your questions into the chat. And without any further delay.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Connor. I'm happy to be here and get the opportunity to share my story with everyone. I'm going to start by giving a little overview of how this presentation is going to look. I'm going to start with sharing my personal story of discovering ketogenic therapy and implementing it, which has had absolutely transformative effects on my quality of life. And then I'm going to give a quick overview of the science and research, the evidence base to date. And then I'm going to talk about the advocacy work that I'm doing in the metabolic psychiatry space and what I've learned being able to connect with other experts by experience and sharing a new framework for them that helps to improve mental and metabolic health called THINK+SMART. Before I even share my personal story, though, I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that in my story, I do talk about the unsafe way that I went off of my antipsychotic medications. And of course, I would never in I would always recommend that anytime medications are being adjusted and when anybody starts ketogenic therapy, they should be working with a prescriber and doing this extremely carefully. Tapering unsafely without being gradual, without the help of a prescriber can be extremely dangerous. And I also want to share that I do talk about how I've now been able to be stable without antipsychotic medications with a bipolar 1 diagnosis for about 4 years now, using solely metabolic therapies as my form of treatment. In my role at Metabolic Mind, I get to connect with a number of individuals who, like me, have entirely eliminated medications. This is a new emerging field, metabolic psychiatry, that is evolving, and research is happening right now to try to understand more about the underlying mechanisms of ketogenic therapy. And we don't yet know, what percentage of patients might be able to use metabolic therapies as their sole form of treatment as an alternative to medications. That being said, I also meet a number of patients who have no intention of ever eliminating their meds. They want to do it ketogenic therapy adjunctively, and it just helps improve their quality of life and helps counter side effects of medications. So I am not anti-psychiatry, I'm not anti-medication. I just want all patients to know that this is an option worth exploring, and it can be great as an adjunctive treatment. I'm not trying to tell anybody to go off of their medications, but just to look into how this new form of treatment might help improve some of their quality of life, lessen symptoms, and in some cases, actually put all symptoms into remission like it did for me. So to share my story really from the beginning, when I was first diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, at the time I was a master's student and it felt like my future was bright. I actually had a full scholarship from Rotary International to get my master's degree in London, and it was related to a nonprofit social enterprise organization I had started in India that helped empower women economically by employing them in garment manufacturing. I was really passionate about working with that community, helping to eradicate poverty, helping women to be able to educate their children. It was a time that I felt my future was really bright. And my first psychotic episode really came seemingly out of nowhere, to the extent that right before I had my first psychotic episode, my mom had actually been visiting me in London, and even she didn't see any indication that things were awry. In retrospect, I can understand that there were signs and symptoms of hypomania, but up till that point in my life, I was 28 at the time, I had seen these I had just thought I was someone who was very passionate. It seemed like an asset that I had a lot of energy and motivation and enthusiasm for life. I didn't understand that it could be a symptom of hypomania that would eventually tip over into full-blown psychosis. And so that first episode that came out of nowhere, it was, I'll of course never forget it. It was a night that I was working on a paper. And like so many times I had done this in my undergrad, working on my degree where I waited till to finish everything right before the deadline, so stay up all night trying to bring all my thoughts together, synthesize them, and finish a paper. Usually I'd finish at, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., crash and go to sleep and submit the paper. But what happened that night is that I basically my thoughts never came together and synthesized. Instead, I started to hallucinate and become delusional, and I never crashed, but I stayed up for a few nights on end. I was alone in the apartment. I don't even know how many nights I was awake, and it got to the point where I thought I saw a snake. Weaving through my apartment, slithering through my apartment. I thought my clothes were moving on their own. Eventually, I wandered out of my apartment into the streets, totally delusional, and actually ended up wandering into a church where at the time it turned out they were teaching English as a second language classes. And I talked to the instructor and, asked very kindly, can you please introduce me to God? And I was totally convinced that he would I had a very important conversation to have with God, so I thought he would introduce me, but instead, of course, he called the police, and the police had to drag me kicking and screaming, from that church, and I ended up in an inpatient psychiatric facility. Like so many others in a psychotic episode, I had no self-reflection, didn't understand that I was ill, and I had all these conspiracy theories and paranoia in my head, and they had to hold me down and inject me with medication. And at the time, I truly believed that I was being murdered. It was a horrifying experience, and I was in the hospital for about a month and a half. And it wasn't even till a while after being out of the hospital, I think that I really was able to grasp what had happened to me and that I had been a psych patient and that I had completely lost touch with reality and what it meant to have this new bipolar diagnosis. And as soon as I started coming back to reality, it felt like I was coming back to this fragmented, fractured life that wasn't my own. I felt like I had brain damage. And I looked back at pictures of myself, from just months prior when I felt like I was on top of the world. And I felt like I was mourning the death of myself, like I was grieving. I felt so different from that person in the photographs. And I just thought that my life was never going to be the same. I was deeply suicidal and depressed for about a year following that psychotic episode. And I during that time of depression, that was so dark and so difficult to get through. I still think of it as kind of a miracle that I survived. And my body changed extremely during that time as well. Being on antipsychotic medications, I put on more than 70 pounds. And I just always felt like I had brain fog and fatigue. Eventually, the suicidal ideation did subside, and I was able to live independently and work and everything like that. But I really never felt like I got back to baseline. I never felt like myself again. I always felt low on energy. I would come home from work and pretty much want to go straight to bed. Life was pretty dark. I purposefully worked a job that was not challenging for me because I just didn't have any passion or enthusiasm left for life. I felt like my cognitive functioning was never quite the same, and I didn't have the same level of creativity that I knew before my diagnosis. And I do remember kind of one of the lowest tipping points before my life started to change, before I found what I consider the beginning of my healing journey. And like so many others who have bipolar disorder and feel like they are being controlled by their illness, I found some relief in self-medicating. So I was basically a high-functioning alcoholic. I would smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. I ate a lot of junk food to self-soothe. Prior to becoming sick, I was someone who aspired to be healthy, thought I would eat, I ate a vegetarian diet, mostly whole foods that I considered to be healthy, and I exercised. But after having this illness that I felt was so mysterious and I just couldn't control, that there was that part of me that was just like, what's even the point of trying? So I had in many ways given up on life, and I felt pretty worthless and hopeless. So like many others, I ended up in a not so healthy relationship as well. And when I caught my boyfriend cheating on me, of course it felt like it validated my worst thoughts about myself, that I was worthless and unlovable and was never going to have a good quality of life again. And after that happened, I spent a few days basically in bed, just drinking NyQuil, only getting up maybe to have a drink and smoke. And it was just a very dark place. But I remember during that time, it's when I started to look for a glimmer of hope. And I started to try my hardest to think, I cannot go on living like this forever. I have to envision a brighter future, a better quality of life. I have to find my joy again. I can't keep on living like this. And so very slowly I started to make positive steps, by cutting out the negative coping habits, getting rid of the alcohol and the junk food, and starting to journal and meditate regularly. And mainly was doing visualization meditations, trying to conjure up a better version of myself, imagining what that brighter future would look like. Um, just wanting to inspire hope. I also discovered intermittent and extended fasting, which really I always felt incredible when I fasted, and this really started to change my quality of life. And I slowly but surely started to reclaim my quality of life. So that journey started in about 2018, and when I started to feel gradually, I was able to lose a lot of the weight and just rediscover my creativity. My brain started working better again. And I got to this point where I thought, well, it's been almost a decade now. Like, do I still even need my medication? Maybe I'm not even really bipolar anymore. I had these kind of thoughts, and didn't safely taper off my medication with any help, didn't get expert advice on this. Like I said, I would never recommend anybody go down that path. But at the time I went off my medication, and I had tried it one other time previously, and it was a similar pattern where I was fine for about 8 months before I started to get hypomanic. And then eventually that tipped into a full-blown psychotic episode. So in total, I've had 3 episodes, one in the middle when I had tried to go off, and that third after I had started to feel better, and then ended up having this relapse psychotic episode. It was after I got out of the hospital that third time. Of course, in the hospital, they put me back on olanzapine and told me that you have a lifelong chronic illness. If you want to maintain your mental stability, you have no choice but to take this medication for the rest of your life. And of course, I knew what would happen if I started to take that medication again. I knew that I would put back on all the weight. I knew that I would feel the brain fog, the fatigue, the lack of energy, the loss of my creativity, the blunting of my emotions. And I thought, I just cannot do that to myself again. I was only starting to feel like I was reclaiming the person I had been prior to my diagnosis. And so I was faced with this really difficult decision. Um, you know, there was a part of me, and of course, a lot of people wouldn't respect this point of view, but there was that part of me that felt like I would rather at least have moments where I felt like I was alive, moments of joy and awe, than live in this numb, sedated state for the rest of my life. I thought about artists and musicians like Van Gogh, and what would it have been if he lived his life in a numb, sedated state, and maybe, be able to survive, but he'd never been able to enrich the world or see that beauty that's reflected in his art. And I think it's wrong for us to blame patients and call this an irresponsible decision, because up to a third of patients, are non-compliant with medications when they feel like it's diminishing their quality of life. And that tells me we need to find better, more effective treatments. We need cutting edge science to find other solutions for people if the medications are inadequate in this way. So during that time, I decided, luckily I had this thought, maybe there's an alternative out there that I just don't know about. So I started scouring the internet, searching for like, are there any alternatives to medications that people are doing that are proving effective? And I looked at a number of variety of things. I saw some supplement protocols, some different things, but eventually I stumbled on the work of a Harvard psychiatrist named Dr. Christopher Palmer. I found his website, and there was not a ton of information, but a little bit of information and some case studies talking about individuals who'd been able to put their symptoms into remission using a ketogenic diet, and some underlying science behind why ketogenic therapy was effective. And it's actually known as a fasting mimicking diet. So there's similar mechanisms that happen when you're fasting. So it really clicked for me as I thought about how wonderful I always felt when I was fasting, because during that time I would be in a state of ketosis. And there's certain things that happen biologically when you're in that state too that affect the quality and quantity of the mitochondria in your cells, increasing your body and brain's energy. So I really felt like this was a promising thing and that I had nothing to lose by giving it a try. So that was in the summer of 2021. And I decided to go ahead and do ketogenic therapy. And, like anything else, it's been a journey and it wasn't always easy. And I'm actually a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian my whole life. So, of course, at first I was like, can you even do ketogenic therapy as a vegetarian? It's known primarily to be a very meat-based diet. But really, there's so many different ways to customize it. And so I was able to get into ketosis and reap benefits right away. At the time, since it was when I was right out of the hospital, I was in a state of depression. And in the past, following psychosis and having suicidal depression, for me, it would last about a year. When I started doing ketogenic therapy, the severity of the depression lessened pretty much immediately. I was no longer suicidal, but I was still a little bit depressed for a couple months, and then the depression lifted entirely. And in terms of being able to now be stable, going on 4 years of stability without antipsychotic medications, that really exceeded my wildest dreams. I thought, maybe this will help me manage symptoms. I wasn't entirely confident that it could completely keep me from experiencing another manic episode and having to be hospitalized. And, I'm not saying I could never have a relapse episode, but the quality of life that I've experienced over the past 4 years has been incredible. I'm still pinching myself because I feel like it's not just restored me to baseline, the person I was prior to my illness, but I've actually experienced post-traumatic growth. And I wouldn't take back the experiences I have had, even if I could, because it's given me so much will and so much respect for our sense of agency and the choices that we make every day. And not to mention being able to connect with an incredible community of other experts by experience in the field of metabolic psychiatry who are spreading this message of hope to others. So I'm now going to share my slide deck because I want to talk a little bit about my journey from having that personal transformation to eventually discovering a broader field and getting into advocacy work. Sorry, where did it go? I pulled up the right screen. Give me just a second. Where did it go? There we go. Sorry about that. So Dr. Christopher Palmer, as I said, is one of the pioneers in the field of metabolic psychiatry. When I first discovered his website, it was before his book Brain Energy came out, which has kind of taken the world by storm. Brain Energy was released in November of 2022. And during that time, I was fortunate that I interacted with Dr. Palmer on social media and ended up being able to connect with him. And I was invited to work with him and a small team of volunteers to create a strategy to help raise awareness of his brain energy theory that he talks about in his wonderful book, Brain Energy. And it's really, it's the idea that psychiatric symptoms are often caused by metabolic dysfunction that impacts the brain. And it's too much to really give a good overview because metabolism is so complex. So it's hard to say it short and succinct. So I would really recommend that anybody who's interested actually read Brain Energy and check out his book. But in essence, The idea is that when we talk about metabolism, what that really means is metabolism is the way that your body transforms and utilizes energy, made from the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe. And the reason ketogenic therapy can be effective for so many people struggling with psychiatric symptoms appears to be based on two things. Like I said, science is going to discover more, and these things are being investigated. But one is the fuel source itself. So, our body, like a hybrid car, that can run on electric or gas, our body can run on only two fuel sources, ketones and glucose. And part of the theory is that some people, if they become insulin resistant, may have trouble utilizing glucose. So, ketones become a more efficient fuel source to help fuel their brains. The other thing is, as I mentioned, a ketogenic diet is a fasting mimicking diet. So we know from mouse models that this has an impact on a cellular level. It can actually improve the quality and quantity of the mitochondria in our cells. So by repairing that, by improving the quality and quantity of our mitochondria, our body becomes more efficient at utilizing energy. I'm going to play a short video that also, kind of summarizes this theory.
Many individuals are finding success using a ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder. One of the main reasons why is based on Dr. Chris Palmer's brain energy theory. Let's hear a little more from Dr. Palmer.
The brain energy theory suggests that mental disorders are metabolic disorders affecting the brain. What I am arguing is that when people's brains are malfunctioning and resulting in symptoms of chronic depression or anxiety or bipolar symptoms or psychotic symptoms, the reason for that, the foundational reason for the brain to malfunction in those ways is metabolic in nature. And in fact, understanding this opens up entirely new ways to think about and to treat mental illness.
Like the use of a ketogenic diet, there are several mechanisms that allow a ketogenic diet to help with bipolar disorder. But let's focus on the mechanism most related to brain energy itself, ketones. Two core features of poor metabolic health are insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction, both of which result in the brain not getting enough energy to perform optimally, contributing to or maybe even causing symptoms of mental illness. Ketones are energy molecules produced on a ketogenic diet that can replace glucose as the brain's primary fuel source. Part of what makes ketones so special is they enter brain cells through unique transporters that aren't impaired by insulin resistance and can even be used by damaged mitochondria. When it comes to the metabolic nature of the brain, providing enough energy is essential. Fortunately, the more ketones available in the blood, the more the brain takes in for energy, and ketones provide more energy per unit compared to glucose. The benefits of keto for mental health issues like bipolar disorder is not limited to energy. A ketogenic diet and ketones can also help combat inflammation, balance neurotransmitters, and improve gut health.
So, getting the opportunity to work with Dr. Palmer, it was about a year into my journey with ketogenic therapy, and it was so wonderful to connect with him and other advocates who had lived experience. It was really an uplifting part of my journey. During that time, he also told me about a new foundation that had started, a family foundation, Bazuki Group, based on the story of a young man named Matt Bazuki who he had actually treated. So Matt Bazuki's pictured here, and if you visit Metabolic Mind's website, he shares his own whole personal journey as part of our THINK+SMART framework. So you can hear all about the strategies that he used to transform his mental health and put his bipolar 1 disorder into remission. But when I first heard about this family foundation, I decided to listen to a podcast where his mom, Jan Ellison Bazuki, the founder of Bazuki Group and Metabolic Mind, along with her husband, Dave, who is the founder and CEO of Roblox, she told her story and her experiences with Matt. And Matt was, a bright, gifted young man who, after being diagnosed with bipolar 1 and experiencing psychosis, he basically had treatment resistant bipolar 1 disorder. So they had all the resources to try all the best treatments, and he had seen so many different prescribers, and he was on a cocktail of medications. They had tried him on over 29 different medications, but really just nothing was effective, and he was never getting better. And Jan talked about, how she had a psychiatrist basically tell her that she was going to have to accept that her son was never going to be the same again, that she was going to have to accept this diminished version of him. And, she explained, well, I didn't want 50% of my son back. I didn't want 60% of my son back. I wanted my full son back. I wanted him restored. I wanted him to be himself again. And it made me so emotional listening to this, because that's really how I had felt about myself. I felt that there was a part of me that had gone missing, and I just wanted to reclaim my full sense of self again. And this therapy has given me that back. In fact, for a long time, it felt like I was rediscovering parts of myself that I didn't even realize I was missing before. And Matt's story was incredible, because once he discovered ketogenic therapy, after 5 years of struggling with all these ineffective treatments and being pretty much disabled by his condition, he wasn't able to work or anything. Within 4 months, he started to stabilize and become himself again. He also started in 2021, in January in 2021. And today he's working full time, living independently, has a girlfriend, has a wonderful, fulfilling life, and has gotten his full life back. And in my role, I get to meet with many people who've had a similar experience, who had treatment resistant conditions and are now thriving again, thanks to ketogenic and other metabolic therapies. And so how I became an advocate, of course, through that network with Dr. Palmer, I was introduced to Jan, and I started out as a freelance writer for Metabolic Mind. And eventually that evolved into me being able to turn my passion into my profession, which I'm just so grateful for. So I'm going to explain a little more about the difference between Bazooki Group and Metabolic Mind. So Bazooki Group really is looking at the science, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the clinical trials, things that are happening there. But Bazooki Group knows that in order to make this a more widely available form of treatment that is recognized, they need to build the scientific credibility with clinicians. So they funded pilot trials as well as randomized controlled trials that are active right now to really have that evidence about efficacy. Metabolic Mind, on the other hand, is the public-facing organization. We have a podcast, we have a blog where I've written many articles. We also have guest writers, scientific articles. These are public-facing because we understand that ketogenic therapy is relatively safe and low risk. And for some people, the upside is absolutely incredible. So we believe that people deserve access to this therapy and all the educational resources that we can provide them today. Obviously, a lot of people who have suffered feel like, they've lost precious years of their lives. So we feel we do not need to wait for the science to catch up to provide the information that people need to pursue this form of treatment safely and effectively. In terms of the research, if you're at all interested, please visit our website on the research page, because there's really comprehensive information there, including interviews with some of the primary investigators in these trials. And they explain a little bit about some of the underlying mechanisms that they're exploring in their research. Part of the goal of these trials is not just to show that it's effective, but to understand more about the underlying mechanisms that make it an effective form of treatment. In the future, there's the potential that we'll understand biomarkers so that we'd be able to better say ahead of time which patients are most likely to respond to ketogenic therapy. I also wanted to say, in terms of thinking about the safety of this approach and whether it's something worth trying now, ketogenic diet was originally developed to treat treatment-resistant refractory epilepsy. And there's been over 100 years of research looking at the ketogenic diet to stop seizures in treatment-resistant epilepsy. Interestingly, of course, we use many of the same medications in psychiatric conditions that are used in epilepsy, which again indicates that there are underlying mechanisms there. And the ketogenic diet really needs to be understood as having medication-like effects that really change your biochemistry and change neurotransmitters. It is a very powerful intervention. So the next video I'm going to show is about, I'm going to end talking about a tool, a framework for mental and metabolic health that we've developed at Metabolic Mind. It was the brainchild of the founder, Jana Ellison-Bazuki, but it's been shaped by our expert by experience community. And in this framework, many of them share their own personal journeys that mirror my own, and the strategies with ketogenic therapy as a cornerstone, and then other metabolic interventions that they use to improve their quality of life. So first I'm going to show a little teaser video just to make you curious about the model, and then I'll go into some of the details.
The intrusive thoughts that I had really struggled with my whole life were just gone.
This is actually working for me, and I didn't even know that that was a possibility. I just assumed that my life would be a series of different medications forever.
The program is more than just ketogenic therapy. At the end of the day, it's about creating a sense of agency.
It's cool to have a tool that I really believe in.
These interventions are, they're not just powerful, they're empowering. It's a movement that's happening right now.
Everyone is going to want to know, what the heck did you do?
So many wonderful things to kind of explore.
I was feeling the benefits from it pretty much right away.
I think I'm like a fully functioning person now.
To know that you have that support and connection makes these tasks feel so much more possible.
The quality of life is incomparable to what you're giving up. It was an awakening.
I suppose THINK+SMART in many ways is like creating a more natural setting for people.
It felt like things were just kind of starting to click.
The main reason to do it is because it works.
Now I participate in life. I don't just let life pass me by.
Thank you for sharing this. This is, this is really important.
If you aren't in remission from your illness, and like, what do you have to lose?
Together, I truly believe we can fuel a mental health revolution.
So the model, as I said, is THINK, which stands for Therapeutic Integration of Nutritional Ketosis, and then SMART, which is sleep, move, avoid, rebuild, and track. And I'm mostly going to focus on the THINK segment because in SMART, there are a lot of things that we would basically consider intuitive, but also that have been backed by so much research. So those are things like optimizing the quality of your sleep, integrating exercise, avoiding drugs and alcohol and junk food, rebuild, finding community and purpose, practices like mindfulness and meditation, and then tracking, just keeping track of your mental health symptoms and the different lifestyle choices you're making that may be impacting those symptoms. I did get a chance to look at the International Bipolar Foundation website and some of the amazing, beautiful Faces of Hope and Recovery profiles on the website. And I saw that many of the individuals sharing the tactics that have worked for them shared things that are in our SMART models. So that was great to see. But I thought I'd spend a little more time on THINK, since that's what's probably newer to most of those in the audience. And it's really important, like I mentioned, this is a really powerful therapy that has medication-like effects, powerful enough to stop seizures. So you really need to think of it as a medication. That's why we always emphasize at Metabolic Mind that this is a therapy that should be done with clinical oversight, a plan for monitoring and adjusting medications as needed. It's basically like adding another medication. Sometimes being in ketosis, there's certain medications that ketosis actually interferes with the way that medication acts. So sometimes people will actually experience heightened side effects from their meds that need to be adjusted down, even if it's not their intention to taper. And if someone is not aware of this, they might actually think that the side effects are from the diet, when reality it's an impact of the interaction between the diet and medication. So this is one of the trickiest things that people have to work on as they're doing a ketogenic diet, is just having that care team. And of course, with this being an emerging field, not all psychiatrists understand metabolic therapies. So it is important for an individual who really wants to do this to be educated and to advocate for themselves with their care team. And we do recommend, if at all possible, getting one keto coach, dietitian, or therapist who can coordinate with you and your care team. But even then, we realize some people have budget constraints, and that unfortunately today is still often an out-of-pocket expense. But these are some of the different things, 10 different areas that people need to think about when they're doing keto as a therapy. So thinking about the minimum duration for ketogenic therapy. At the moment, it appears people can respond very differently. For some people, they may feel an impact and improvement within days to weeks. And for others, it can take an extended period of time, months. And I actually even talked to someone recently who said this has been life-changing for her, but it took almost a year for her to see any real impact on her mental health. And this was an individual with schizophrenia. Who was also disabled and is now starting to work again and just feeling so much better. We ask people to look at their lab work. Sometimes we want to make sure that people supplement properly. There's certain supplements you may need to take while doing a ketogenic diet. As I said before, keto is actually not a specific diet. It can be tailored to many different dietary approaches, such as vegetarian, vegan, carnivore, paleo. There's so many ways to do keto. The real idea is just that you have to reduce carbohydrates enough so that your body is low enough in insulin that it starts producing ketones to use as your alternative fuel source. People need to look at putting together their macronutrient ratios. A lot of people see success from integrating some intermittent fasting. People need to start to figure out what a good target level of ketosis is for them, and that can vary greatly from individual to individual. And we always encourage people to actually test their ketones, because the key to being in this therapy is that you have to actually get into ketosis. And only by measuring and getting that feedback can you understand how you feel at different ketone levels. Also, people's metabolisms can be very different. So you could actually have two people eating an identical diet and their level of ketosis could vary dramatically. So we encourage every individual, this is something that needs to be tailored, and you need to look at your own data, measure your own ketone levels for that feedback, and figure out your unique physiology. And, figuring part of that is understanding when you're going to test your ketones and get that feedback. So I wanted to end with some resources. As I said, at Metabolic Mind, you can find all of our podcasts. They're really comprehensive and cover the ins and outs of this therapy, both from the expert by experience, lived experience perspective, as well as talking to clinicians and researchers. You can also check out Mental Health Keto. She has a metabolic psychiatric recovery program that does provide some scholarships for individuals on government disability, and she also has group programs as well, where it is educational support, helping the individual completely understand the ins and outs of ketogenic therapy. It's not a medical care program, but it's peer support and educational support. It's run by Nicole Laurent, who's a licensed mental health counselor and just a wonderful resource. I also wanted to share about Metabolic Collective that you could check out. This is a new grassroots nonprofit organization. I'm involved as a volunteer board member. And the idea for this, many of the individuals involved in help launching it were part of the small group that worked with Dr. Christopher Palmer. And we all saw such value of having that be kind of a component of our healing journey to connect with others. And so this organization is going to be all about mobilizing grassroots volunteers, mainly peers and family, who want to help raise awareness of this form of treatment and also just find value in connecting with one another for kind of mutual aid peer support. So thank you so much for allowing me to come and share. And I believe we have time for a Q&A.
Wonderful presentation, Hannah. Thank you so much. We will now begin our Q&A session, so please type your questions into the chat. And it looks like we do have a question from an anonymous attendee. What are some of the foods you can eat on a ketogenic vegetarian diet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I said, people are often surprised that you can do this as a vegetarian. So I get that question a lot. I can eat I eat a lot of vegetables that are lower in carbs. So obviously I can't eat high carb vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes, but I eat a lot of spinach and kale and broccoli and cauliflower, just lots of veggies. I love salads with nice fatty, creamy dressings. For my fat sources, I love coconut milk, coconut oil, avocado oil. I, of course, try to eat enough protein, so I eat tempeh and tofu and seitan. Um, I do like to use a little bit of monk fruit sweetener, alternative sweeteners, and do make myself some desserts like chocolate mousse. I am dairy free at this point, but I eat eggs. Eggs is a really good nutritious source for me and very satiating. And using eggs, I do make some baked goods sometimes using almond flour and coconut flour, or alternatives like that with eggs. I'll also say I do like ethnic food. You know, as I mentioned, I spend quite a bit of time in India. I love Indian food and Thai food. So I like to use a lot of fresh spices and herbs to keep the diet fun and interesting. And you can find so many great recipes online. Many of the people I connect with, and I also have a friend named Diane Harwood who's been doing vegan ketogenic therapy for a number of years now. And like me, she finds her diet satiating and enjoyable. You know, in today's modern world too, when you think about the grocery store, we just have so much access to alternative different types of foods that we wouldn't have had historically. So I still feel like there's a lot of variety, and I have so many recipes I haven't even had time to make yet. So.
That was a wonderful response, Hannah. Thank you. Our next question comes from Andra Carr. Are there people that this does not help, the ketogenic diet?
So that is one of the things that the research is still trying to understand. I cannot say for sure. I've only anecdotally heard of a couple non-responders. For the most part, it seems like everybody, even if they're using it adjunctively, sees some benefits in terms of like both improved physical and mental health. But the truth is, it's going to take time for the science to really be able to answer this question. And as I said, part of the research, they're trying to understand better the underlying mechanisms and if there might be a way to look at certain biomarkers to understand if maybe there's a certain phenotype, a certain type of patient who is most likely to respond to this form of treatment. And we don't know, it could be a matter of degrees too, that some people respond, but they're not able to completely eliminate medications and kind of need to do that adjunctively, whereas some patients like me and others I've met are able to actually use it as an alternative. There's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. From a lived experience perspective, I will share my thoughts on it, which is I'm optimistic it will help a large number of patients, but just theoretically, if I was starting this journey and say they had a number and they said, okay, this only works for 15% of patients, I'm hopeful it'll work for much more than that. But even if I had been told it works for only 15% of patients, but it can have an absolutely remarkable transformative effect for that, subset of patients, I absolutely would have done it either way. Because to me, at the end of the day, it's a small sacrifice, to change your diet for a certain period of time for a potential incredible upside. So I think it's well worth trying even before we know, what percentage of patients it helps. But of course, this is a personal decision, and I realize others may feel differently about it.
And our next question is from Sunel Guerra. Do you use diet charts that list like the do's and don'ts? Are they a part of the ketogenic diet?
So Okay, so there's a lot of different guides you can find online that talk about different types of foods that you should and shouldn't eat and help with figuring out how to measure your carbohydrates, the grams that you're eating. And then, like I said, individuals are going to want to personalize that as they go. So they should get some kind of way to measure their ketones and see how they respond at certain levels of carbs. And the reason I always emphasize how important it is to really understand your own physiology, when I started this as a vegetarian and tried to initially count my carbs, eating more vegetables, it felt like I was going to have to be really restrictive. But I realized with testing my own ketones, I could eat quite a few vegetables that were technically higher in carbs, but also had a lot of fiber and still stay in a high level of ketosis. But yes, if you go to our Metabolic Mind website, there is a families and peers page, and there's tons of great resources on that page. You can find some beginners diet guides. They're linked out, they're through Diet Doctor, but they talk about exactly how to structure the diet and the foods to eat and not eat, how to measure your carbs, and all those kinds of nitty-gritty details. Metabolic Mind doesn't focus on creating those kind of guides, but there are a lot of resources out there.
Wonderful. And our next question is from the same guest as last one. And her question is, does the keto diet have to have intermittent fasting as part of it?
That's a great question. No, it definitely does not have to have intermittent fasting. It's something that, you know, when in our Think Smart model, like I said, we love to share the diverse variety of patient experiences because nobody does metabolic therapies in the exactly same way. They're very much tailored. So anecdotally, there's a lot of people who say that they benefit from doing intermittent and even some extended fasting from varying from individual to individual. But there are plenty of people who say that they don't like the way that they feel when they fast and they just focus on eating a ketogenic diet and being in ketosis, and they do great with the therapy as well. So it's definitely not a requirement. And I will say a part of the benefit I see and others may see from intermittent fasting, it is a way to definitely help raise your ketone levels and get into those deeper levels of ketosis because obviously you're really restricting carbs when you're taking a period just of not eating. So it can be beneficial, but again, only if it works for you.
Wonderful. And our next question is from an anonymous attendee is what is the research on glucose spikes / insulin response and bipolar disorder?
Yeah, I'm afraid this is not the ideal question for me to answer as a non-researcher, just as an individual with lived experience. I know there's uh, I'll look into it and see if I can shoot something over to you, Connor, that you could share. I'm sure that's probably been something that was investigated in the pilots, but I don't know what kind of data on that is publicly available.
Excellent. And our next question is from Eric Ballin Watkins. Is the THINK+SMART free?
Yes, yep, it's an absolutely free model. Always going to be free. It's just designed for people to take advantage of.
And our next question is from an anonymous attendee. It says, is there an optimum level of ketone or is it an individual specific?
Yeah, we recommend that it should be individualized. That being said, we see like the general recommendation for psychiatric conditions is 1.5 to 3 millimoles per liter. But again, that can vary, and some people say that they feel fine anywhere in nutritional ketosis above 0.5, where others prefer getting into deep ketosis as high as 4 or 5.
Excellent. And our next question is from Emily Young. Is the ketogenic diet similar to the forks over knives diet, which is the whole plant-based?
So I'm familiar with the forks over knives diet because I used to do more of a vegan diet for quite a long time. I will say that like we generally recommend people approach the ketogenic diet in a primarily whole foods way, that they stay away from ultra processed foods, including, keto friendly ultra processed food snacks and stuff like that. So that is one thing it shares in common. But otherwise, the general difference would be a ketogenic diet is more of a high fat, low carb diet, where from my understanding, Forks Over Knives, the vegan approach allows for healthy carbs, things like whole grains and lentils and beans and things that would not be ketogenic. But as I mentioned, ketogenic diet can be tailored. So like I'm doing, I guess, what would be kind of equivalent to a Forks Over Knives version of keto, though I do eat eggs. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear enough.
Absolutely, it is. And then our next question is, are there keto measurement tools available online? Are those helpful?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a different variety of types of tools that you can use. What I used and what's probably the most popular is through Keto Mojo. You can get a blood meter. So it's a tiny little prick on your finger, and you can just measure your ketones that way. And it's the most accurate, and it gives you an exact ketone level. That being said, it can add up in the budget. It's a little more on the pricey side. So if you're looking for something more budget friendly, there's also urine strips available, and those aren't quite like, they don't give you an exact number of ketosis. It shows you a general range. But I've talked to plenty of people who've used that as their main source for measuring ketones and done very well with this form of therapy. So those options are both valid. There are also breath meters available, but don't necessarily highly recommend those, and don't talk to too many others with lived experience who've used those as their go-to measurement tool.
Well, that's all the questions from our audience. Thank you, everyone in our community. If we didn't get a chance to get to your question, feel free to reach out to me at info@ibbpf.org. I'm always happy to share some resources. As part of Mental Health Awareness Month, we're especially grateful for opportunities like this to explore new ideas and lived experience that can help people on their journey. This webinar will soon be available in our educational video section of our website and on our YouTube channel as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you to everyone in our audience who joined us. And of course, Hannah, thank you for sharing your lived experience story. Would you like to close?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been interesting in this format that that I can't see anybody's face, because I'm sure that so many in the audience here are just wonderful people who I would love to connect with. I would say that one of the best things for me about becoming an advocate and becoming involved in this movement was getting to know so many amazing people with experiences similar to my own, because there was a long time where I felt kind of ashamed of my illness and kind of stigmatized and didn't really connect with others who'd been through similar things. And now that I get to connect with so many people who've been through that, and like I said, experience post-traumatic growth and go on to live wonderful lives, I'm inspired by so many people and just grateful for the friendships and connections I've made with others. And so I hope that, maybe I'll connect with some of you someday. And I hope that you found this helpful and that you'll check out our resources at Metabolic Mind.
Thank you, Hannah. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye all.